The night Minnie Morgan buried her husband, the sky above Caldwell, Kansas didn't even have the decency to weep. It stayed bone dry and indifferent, as if the whole wide world had already moved on from the fact that she was now utterly, devastatingly alone. It was the spring of 1879, and the prairie wind carried the smell of new grass and distant rain that never quite arrived, a cruelty that felt personal to Minnie as she stood at the fresh mound of dark earth beside the old cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. She and Edmund Morgan had worked for 3 hard years. Edmund had been a good man, not a spectacular one, not a man who set rooms ablaze with his presence, but a steady, quiet, faithful man who had loved her in the only ways he knew how. He had also died owing money to half of Caldwell, and that was the problem she now carried in both hands like a bucket full of stones. The banker's notice had arrived before the funeral flowers had even dried. 30 days, it read in crisp, merciless ink, to satisfy the outstanding loan on the property or vacate the premises. Minnie had held the letter for a long moment in the kitchen doorway, watching the light shift across the floorboard. She had scrubbed on her hands and knees 100 times, and she had made herself a promise that she would not cry. She had cried enough. The tears were spent. What she needed now was something else entirely, something harder, something with edges. She had 2 children. Clara was 7 years old and possessed the alarming solemnity of a child who understood more about adult trouble than she should. Thomas was 5, bright-eyed and restless, forever escaping the yard to chase the grasshoppers that leaped through the tall grass behind the barn. They were the reason Minnie could not simply fold. They were the reason she picked up that letter a second time, straightened her spine until it ached, and began to think. Edmund had borrowed $340 from the First Caldwell Bank, which was owned and operated by a man named Gerald Fitch, whose mustache was as stiff as his sympathy and whose ledger was never wrong. The money had gone toward seed, toward a new plow, toward 2 cows whose milk was supposed to carry them through the lean seasons. 1 cow had died before winter. The other was still alive, thank God, and Minnie milked her every morning with a kind of grim ferocity that frightened the animal just slightly. She had roughly $40 in the tin she kept beneath the loose floorboard in the bedroom, money she had saved over the years in small hidden increments, coins pressed away from grocery money and egg money and the occasional spare bill. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. What she needed was someone in this town to help her, to lend her the money or co-sign an extension with the bank, or perhaps hire her for something that paid decently. And she had told herself that the people of Caldwell were good people, that they had known her and Edmund for 3 years, that there was a kind of frontier community built on the understanding that anyone's hard luck might one day be your own. She had believed that wholeheartedly, right up until the morning she began knocking on doors. She started with the Harrington family, who had the largest spread on the north side of town, and who had eaten at her table twice when the circuit preacher had come through. Martha Harrington had opened the door with a warm expression that faded into something cautious, and then something apologetic the moment Minnie began speaking. Robert Harrington appeared behind his wife with his arms crossed and a look of strained discomfort on his face, and said that times were tight for everyone, that they had their own worries, that he was sorry for her loss. The door closed gently, which was worse somehow than if it had been slammed. The Coopers were next, and they kept her on the porch and spoke to each other in low murmurs before telling her they were in no position to help. The school teacher, Miss Aldridge, who was a single woman and therefore had no money of her own to speak of, wept a little on Minnie's behalf and then apologized for not being able to do more. Doc Perkins said he'd just extended credit to 3 other families and couldn't afford another risk. The minister, Reverend Dalt, prayed with her and gave her a full 10 minutes of sincere spiritual comfort, and then told her he had no access to the church's small reserve fund without a vote of the deacons, who met on Thursdays. It was Thursday. The vote went against her 3-2. She tried the merchants next. Henderson at the general store said he'd already lost too much to credit accounts. The livery man, old Pete Stave, said he was sorry but couldn't put up cash. The woman who ran the boarding house, a stout no-nonsense widow named Frances Dull, said she had barely enough to keep the lights burning herself. Even the lawyer, a young man named Campbell who had come out from St. Louis the previous autumn and still wore city shoes that weren't fully broken in, told her that without collateral, there wasn't much he could recommend except seeking a formal extension from the bank directly, which Minnie had already tried and been refused. She had been walking these streets for 4 days. 4 days of gathering her pride up each morning like a woman gathering eggs from a reluctant hen, carrying it carefully to the door of someone she had considered a neighbor, and having it handed back to her cracked. Her boots were wearing through at the left heel. Clara and Thomas had been left in the care of Mrs. Henley down the road, a kind elderly woman who had nothing either but who gave willingly of her time and her oatmeal, which was more than most. On the morning of the 5th day, Minnie stood in the middle of the packed dirt street and looked at the row of buildings that made up the main road through Caldwell, Kansas, and she tried to think if she had missed anyone. There was a man who lived in the old Dempsey house at the far end of town, the one set a little apart from the rest, with a vegetable garden that was better kept than the house itself, and a corral with 3 horses that were clearly well cared for. She had been avoiding that house. She could not quite say why. People talked about the man who lived there in the careful, sideways manner that people in small towns used when they weren't sure whether a person was dangerous or simply private. His name was Homer Sutton. He had been in Caldwell for about 2 years. He had served as a deputy briefly, then resigned or been asked to leave, depending on who was telling it, and since then he'd kept mostly to himself, doing odd work, breaking horses for ranchers outside of town, doing some hunting and trapping through the winter. He was not the kind of man that people brought casseroles to when he was ill. He was the kind of man people crossed the street to greet, if they greeted him at all, because crossing the street felt like a deliberate act of friendliness that left a record, whereas simply nodding from a distance could mean anything. Minnie had exchanged perhaps 20 words with Homer Sutton in the 3 years she had lived in Caldwell, most of them at the general store, and she remembered that he had quiet gray eyes that seemed to take everything in at once, and a voice that came out measured and low, as if he had trained himself not to waste it. She stood in that street and thought about the 30 days, which were now 21, and about Clara's solemn eyes and Thomas's grasshoppers, and the cow who needed milking every morning whether Minnie was defeated or not, and she picked up her pride one more time and walked to the end of the road. The garden was indeed remarkable for this part of the country, tomato plants already staked and climbing, rows of beans with their cheerful green leaves, a neat herb border along the fence that she recognized as sage and thyme by the smell. She opened the gate and walked up the path and knocked on the door, which was solid and plain, and painted the dark red of dried sumac berries. A long moment passed. She heard movement inside, the sound of boots on a wooden floor, and then the door opened. Homer Sutton was 34 years old, not much taller than she had remembered, perhaps 5 feet 11, built like someone who worked hard and ate plainly, with dark hair shot through at the temples with the first threads of silver and a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble. He was wearing work trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he had a book in his left hand with his finger marking the page, which surprised her enough that she lost her prepared opening sentence completely. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing, waiting. "Mr. Sutton," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, which she was grateful for. "I am Minnie Morgan. My husband was Edmund Morgan, who passed 3 weeks ago now. I have come to you because I have knocked on every other door in this town and been turned away, and I have 21 days before the bank takes my home and my land, and I have 2 children who need that land, and I am asking if you would be willing to talk." She watched something move through his expression, not pity. She noticed with a sharp relief, because she could not have stood another person's pity, but rather something more attentive, something that processed what she had said the way a careful man processes information before he speaks. He stepped back from the door and held it open wider. "Come in, Mrs. Morgan," he said. The inside of the house was spare and clean in the way of a person who does not accumulate things they do not need. There was a table with 2 chairs, a small iron stove, shelves of neatly arranged supplies, and one wall that held, instead of the usual domestic decoration, a topographical map of the surrounding territory pinned flat against the boards. There was a single bookshelf with perhaps 20 volumes, which was more books than she had seen in any home in Caldwell besides the minister's. He cleared the table of the papers he had spread across it. She caught a glimpse of numbers, figures, what looked like survey notations, and gestured to one of the chairs. She sat down. He put the kettle on without asking, which she appreciated. "Tell me the whole of it," he said, settling into the opposite chair with the book set aside. "Not just the debt, the whole situation." So she did. She told him about Edmund's loan and the failed cow and the seed that had yielded less than expected last summer and the second cow's milk income and the $40 in the tin and the 21 days remaining. She told him about the 4 days of knocking on doors. She told him plainly and without ornament, because she had been a farmer's wife for 3 years and before that a schoolteacher's daughter in Missouri, and she had been raised to speak plainly about facts even when the facts were unpleasant. He listened with the full weight of his attention, which was something she had not experienced in a long time, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table. $300, he said, more to himself than to her. "The bank won't negotiate. Gerald Fitch has the warmth of a fence post and the flexibility of an iron bar," she said, and then caught herself, because it was not appropriate to speak that way to a near stranger about a prominent townsman. But something shifted in Homer Sutton's face just slightly. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that might generously be called the beginning of a smile, and he said, "That's a fair description of Fitch from what I've seen." He stood and poured the tea, which was strong and plain and very good, and he said, "I have a proposition to put to you, Mrs. Morgan. I want you to hear all of it before you answer, and I want you to know that no part of it is meant to take advantage of your situation." She wrapped both hands around the cup and nodded. "I have been saving money since I was 19 years old," he said. "I live simply by preference, not by necessity. I have at present approximately $500 in coin and banknotes in this house, saved from work I have done and some land I sold in Texas 4 years ago. $300 of it I will give to you directly today, not as a loan but as a gift, no strings and no repayment." She opened her mouth to speak and he held up one hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I will also speak to Fitch personally and make sure he processes the payment correctly and marks the account satisfied. I have dealt with Fitch before on other matters and I know how he operates, and I want to make sure the paperwork is right. You will keep your home and your land." She stared at him. The morning light came through the single window above the table and lit the steam rising from her teacup, and she thought that she was perhaps dreaming, that the fatigue and the grief and the 5 days of rejection had produced some kind of fever vision. "Why?" she said. It came out quietly, stripped of everything except the genuine need to understand. He looked at her steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "Because you came and asked honestly and you've got 2 young children and a piece of land you worked for, and because I can. That's the whole of it." Minnie Morgan had promised herself she was done crying. She had made that promise firmly, and she had kept it through the minister's prayer, and through Gerald Fitch's cold refusal, and through 4 days of sympathetic faces closing softly against her. But something about the simple, unadorned decency of what this man had just said broke something loose in her chest, and the tears came before she could stop them, quickly and silently, rolling down her face while she sat with both hands around the teacup and her spine still perfectly straight, because she had not promised she wouldn't feel it, only that she wouldn't show it, and apparently that promise was harder to keep. Homer Sutton did not say anything. He got up and came back with a clean cloth from the shelf beside the stove and set it on the table beside her without fanfare, and then he sat back down and gave her the dignity of her silence. When she had regained herself, she wiped her face and set the cloth carefully on the table and said, "I cannot accept a gift of $300 from a man I barely know, Mr. Sutton. That would not be proper, and beyond the propriety of it, it would not sit right with me. I am not a woman who accepts charity." "What would sit right with you?" he asked, and there was no impatience in it, only genuine question. She thought for a moment. "I would accept a loan," she said, "with interest properly noted, and I will pay it back from the harvest and from the milk and from whatever else I can manage. I will sign a note if you require one." He studied her face. 5% interest, he said. "No note required. I'll take you at your word." "I require the note," she said, "for my own conscience." Something in his expression shifted into something that was definitely, this time, a smile, quiet, genuine, reaching his gray eyes in a way that made them look warmer than she had expected. "All right," he said. "We'll write a note." He took a paper and a pen from the shelf and they wrote it out together, she and Homer Sutton, at the plain table in the spare and tidy kitchen, the terms clean and fair, and witnessed only by the morning light and the smell of strong tea, and it was the first time in 21 days that Minnie Morgan felt as though the ground beneath her feet might hold. He walked with her to the bank that same morning. Gerald Fitch, confronted with $300 in cash presented by a man who stood with a certain quiet stillness that suggested he had occupied more dangerous rooms than a bank office, without flinching, processed the transaction with remarkable efficiency, and produced a satisfaction document within the hour. Minnie tucked the document into her bodice, pressed against her heartbeat, and walked back out into the Caldwell morning, feeling something she had nearly forgotten the name of: relief. Plain, clean, unqualified relief. She thanked Homer Sutton on the steps of the bank with the formal gravity that the situation deserved, and he nodded and said she was welcome, and that he hoped things improved from here, and they parted ways with a handshake that she thought about for longer than was entirely appropriate as she walked back to Mrs. Henley's to collect her children. She told herself it was simply that she had been alone for 3 weeks in a state of concentrated fear, and that gratitude was a powerful emotion, and that any decent soul would have stirred feelings of warmth in her by doing what he had done. She told herself this several times over the next few days while she planted the late beans and fixed the fence along the eastern pasture, and set Thomas to gathering eggs with the focused seriousness that the boy brought to every task he was given, which was a quality she recognized from Edmund, and which pierced her heart gently every time she saw it. She did not see Homer Sutton for a week, and then she saw him at the general store on a Wednesday morning, where he was buying flour and a tin of molasses and a pair of work gloves. He nodded to her. She nodded to him. Henderson at the counter watched them with the particular alertness of a man who traffics in other people's information as a secondary business, and Minnie bought her salt and her thread, and said good morning to Mr. Sutton in a voice that was clear and normal, and he said good morning to Mrs. Morgan in a voice that was likewise clear and normal, and that was that. Except that she noticed he had selected the finer weight of work gloves, the kind made from deer hide rather than stiff cowhide, which suggested he had work coming up that required more dexterity than brute protection. She caught herself noticing this and felt faintly ridiculous about it. It was Clara who complicated things, because Clara was 7 and possessed of both her mother's directness and a child's absolute indifference to social convention. She had been told about Mr. Sutton, that he was the man who had helped them save their home, and she had absorbed this information with the gravity of a person recording a significant fact, and then, approximately 10 days after the bank transaction, she had simply walked to the end of the road and knocked on his door, apparently alone, having slipped away from the yard while Minnie was in the barn. Minnie discovered this when she came out of the barn calling Clara's name into the empty yard, and then, following instinct, walked quickly toward the far end of the road and found her daughter sitting on Homer Sutton's porch steps eating an apple, engaged in what appeared to be a perfectly comfortable conversation with a man who was sitting on the top step whittling something from a piece of pine. "Clara Eliza Morgan," Minnie said, arriving breathless and furious and relieved in equal measure. "You do not wander off without telling me where you are going." Clara looked at her with those solemn eyes. "I came to thank Mr. Sutton properly," she said, as if this were obvious. "You said we should always thank people properly." Homer Sutton was watching her with that quiet attentiveness, and he said, "She's been no trouble, Mrs. Morgan. She knocked and asked politely if she could sit on the steps, and she's been telling me about the grasshoppers behind your barn." "Thomas chases them," Clara said. "I think it's undignified." "Clara," Minnie said, sitting down on the bottom step because her heart was still hammering from the fright and also because her knees felt oddly unsteady. "I am sorry, Mr. Sutton. She should not have come without permission." "She came with good intentions," he said. "The apple was mine to offer, and she's good company." He had been whittling a small horse, she saw, the shape of it just emerging from the pine, the curve of a neck, the suggestion of legs. His hands were very steady and precise. She looked away. "Come along, Clara," she said, standing. "Mr. Sutton has work to do." "Actually," Homer said, and then stopped as if he were choosing his words with care. "Mrs. Morgan, I was going to come by your place this week in any case. I have some boards I pulled from the old Dempsey outbuilding that are in good condition, and I noticed your fence along the north pasture is in need of work. I thought I might offer to help if you'd accept it." She looked at him. He met her gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she thought about the fence, which was indeed a problem she had been putting off because she did not know how to fix it properly, and because every hour in the day was already spoken for. And she thought about the note in her bodice and the 5% interest, and the fact that this man had already done more than any person in this town had done, and she said, "I cannot keep accepting help from you, Mr. Sutton." "It's just boards and an afternoon," he said simply, "and the fence needs doing before the cow gets into trouble." Clara looked between the two of them with the evaluative expression of a child who is running calculations. "Mama," she said, "the cow already broke through once." "Clara, she did." Homer Sutton made that not quite a smile again, and Minnie gave up. "Thursday afternoon," she said, "if it's convenient to you." He came on Thursday with the boards loaded in a wagon, and Thomas attached himself to the man's side within approximately 4 minutes of his arrival, with the complete and unconditional devotion that 5-year-old boys extend to any adult male who speaks to them with patience and without condescension. Homer showed him how to hold the hammer and let him drive 2 nails, which Thomas accomplished with a concentration that was purely his father's, and Minnie watched from 30 feet away with her arms crossed and her chest doing something complicated and private that she chose not to examine closely. She had made lemonade because it was the right thing to do, and because the afternoon was warm, and because she needed something to do with her hands. She brought it out when the fence work was finished, and they sat on the porch, she and Homer and the 2 children, and drank the tart, sweating glasses of it while the afternoon light went long and golden across the grass, and the cow moved peacefully in the now-repaired pasture, and the whole scene had a quality to it that Minnie did not trust herself to name. "You're good with them," she said, quietly enough that Clara and Thomas, who had gone off to investigate something in the yard, couldn't hear. "The children." He turned the glass in his hands. "I like children," he said. "They're direct. Clara certainly is." "She's remarkable," he said, with a simplicity that meant he was not performing a compliment, just stating what he had observed. "She's going to be formidable when she's grown." "She already is," Minnie said, and smiled, and when she looked up she found him looking at her with an expression that he didn't quite manage to neutralize before she caught it. Something open and unguarded that lasted only a second before he looked back at the yard, but she had seen it, and it sat in her chest quietly for the rest of the evening. He came back the following week without any particular stated reason, just appeared at the gate on a Saturday morning with a bag of nails and the information that he'd noticed the barn roof had a soft spot, and she let him in because saying no to Homer Sutton had begun to feel like arguing with weather, and because she had admitted to herself in the quiet of the night that she was glad when he came. It was a gradual thing, the way it grew. Not sudden or dramatic, not the lightning-strike romance of the penny novels that had made their way even to the frontier. It was more like the beans she had planted, slow and rooted and daily, each thing building on the last thing until one morning you looked out, and there was something real and green and thriving that had not been there before. He came by on Tuesdays, usually, with some practical purpose that neither of them discussed too closely. A tool she needed, a repair that wanted doing, what he'd cut for her stove. She began leaving coffee on the stove for when he came, and he began timing his arrivals to when the coffee was hot, which they both understood without saying so. They talked. They talked about the land and the planting and the children and the weather, and then gradually they talked about other things. He told her about Texas, about the work he had done there after the war. He had been 16 when the war ended, and had headed west rather than return to a Georgia that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. She told him about Missouri, about her father's schoolroom and the smell of chalk, and the way the autumn light came through the windows onto the rows of children's bent heads, and how she had loved that light as a child without understanding exactly why. She learned things about him sideways, the way you learn most true things about a person. He read extensively history, primarily, and natural science and philosophy, and he had opinions about what he read that were more nuanced than she expected, and more interesting than most conversations she had managed in 3 years of Caldwell. He had been a deputy for 8 months, and had left because the sheriff at the time had asked him to look the other way about certain things involving the treatment of the Osage people who came through the territory, and he had declined to look the other way, and the relationship had deteriorated from there. He said this without self-righteousness, as a plain fact, and moved on, but it lodged in her mind alongside everything else she was collecting about him without fully acknowledging that she was collecting anything at all. He did not push. He did not maneuver or suggest or drop hints. He was simply present and reliable and honest, and the more time she spent in his company, the more she felt the outlines of something she had not expected to feel again so soon, possibly ever again. A wanting that was specific to one person, a warmth that had a name attached to it. It was a Tuesday in late June, 6 weeks after the fence repair, when Thomas fell out of the apple tree. He fell badly, the way children fall when they're overconfident, from a height that was more than he'd told her he was climbing to, and landed on his left arm and screamed in a way that brought Minnie out of the house at a dead run. Homer had been there that morning, had just been preparing to leave, and he was at the tree before she was, already on his knees beside the boy. Thomas was howling, which was good. It meant he was conscious and breathing, but his left arm was held at an angle that made Minnie's stomach plunge. Homer assessed it with his hands, very gently, his voice steady and low as he talked to Thomas through the examination, telling him what he was doing before he did it, keeping the boy anchored to his voice. "It's broken," he said quietly to her, looking up. "Clean break by the feel of it. He needs Doc Perkins. I'll drive him." They went together, she and Homer, Thomas between them in the wagon with his arm splinted with a thin piece of board Homer had taken from the fence scraps, and a strip of cloth from his own shirt, bound up neatly and firmly. Thomas had stopped screaming and was now white-faced and hiccuping and gripping Homer's arm with his good hand with a strength that spoke of complete trust, and Homer drove with one arm around the boy and spoke to him quietly the whole way into town, and Minnie sat on Thomas's other side holding his good hand and watching Homer Sutton's face and understanding, with the clarity that cuts through pretense, exactly what was happening in her own heart. She was falling in love with this man. Not tumbling into it, not swept away by it, but falling with full eyes open. The way you fall when you step deliberately off a ledge because you have looked at the ground below and decided that the fall is worth it. She held Thomas's hand and did not say anything about any of this. Doc Perkins set the arm with a professionalism that he extended generously to the children of town regardless of any financial complexities, and sent Thomas home with a plaster cast and a firm instruction against climbing anything for 6 weeks. Thomas accepted this with the stoic resignation of a person who knows an argument is unwinnable. Clara, who had been left home with Mrs. Henley, received the news of her brother's injury with the precise quantity of sympathy that was warranted and not a drop more, which was Clara's way. Homer stayed for supper that evening. It was not planned. It simply happened the way things happen when a day has been difficult, and the children are finally settling, and there is food on the stove, and neither person is ready for the quiet that comes when the other one leaves. She made a beef stew from the remains of a roast and corn bread from the last of the cornmeal, and they sat at the table after the children were in bed and talked in low voices by the oil lamp and the stove light. And at some point the conversation had moved past the practical and into something more interior, more unguarded, and she found herself saying things she had not said aloud to anyone. She told him about the loneliness, not the dramatic grief of losing Edmund, which had already been processed in stages and was becoming, gradually, a manageable weight, but the deeper, older loneliness that had been there even before, the sense of being a person whose inner life was largely invisible to the people around her, who was known for her capabilities and her reliability and her sensible manner, but not for the things underneath those qualities. He was quiet for a moment after she said this. The lamp put shadows along his jaw and cast his gray eyes in gold. "I know that kind of loneliness," he said. "I thought you might," she said. They looked at each other across the table in the lamp light, and the air between them had the quality of something about to change, a held breath before the release, and she thought he was going to say something more, and she thought she might say something herself. But the moment stretched, and then Clara coughed from the back room and the spell shifted slightly, and he stood and said he should get home, and she stood too and walked him to the door. At the door he stopped and turned, and she was close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him, and he looked at her with that full, quiet attention of his and said, "Mrs. Morgan, Minnie." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it did something to the inside of her ribs that she did not have a precise word for. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything in particular. "Would you," he started, and then stopped, and tried again with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. "I would very much like to take you for a ride on Sunday if the children can be minded, just out onto the prairie where the wildflowers are coming in. If that would be something you'd want." She thought about propriety and about the careful watching eyes of Caldwell, Kansas, and about the note she owed him and the 5% interest and what people would say. And then she thought about his arm around her son in the wagon and the way he had listened to her at this very table 6 weeks ago without pity, and she said, "I would like that very much." He nodded once, the way he did when something was settled, and he said good night and walked down the path to his horse, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go until she couldn't see him any more in the dark. Mrs. Henley was delighted to mind the children on Sunday and made no effort whatsoever to disguise her delight, which Minnie bore with what she felt was remarkable composure. Clara fixed Minnie with a look of profound 7-year-old knowingness and said, "Where are you going, Mama?" And Minnie said, "For a ride." And Clara said, "With Mr. Sutton?" And Minnie said, "Yes." And Clara considered this for a moment and then said, "Good," with the finality of a person who has reviewed the evidence and rendered a verdict. He came at 10 o'clock with 2 horses, his own roan gelding and a smaller bay mare he had borrowed from Pete Stave at the livery, and he had brought a blanket and a basket with bread and cheese and 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a small jar of wild plum preserves he had apparently made himself last autumn, which she discovered when she asked, and he admitted to with the mild embarrassment of a man who considers domestic competence a private matter. They rode out east, away from town, into the wide, rolling grassland where the spring wildflowers were indeed coming in Indian paintbrush in brilliant red-orange, the pale lavender of prairie phlox, the small bright faces of yellow coneflowers scattered through the grass that was still green from the late rains. The sky was immense and blue, and the wind was warm and carried the smell of grass and earth and something sweeter she couldn't name. And they rode side by side without hurrying, and Minnie thought that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere for no urgent purpose, with no crisis to solve and no door to knock on, and nothing required of her except presence. They stopped at a low rise that looked out over a broad sweep of the valley, and he spread the blanket and they sat and ate the bread and cheese and the eggs and the plum preserves, which were better than anything she had tasted in months, and he told her that he had found the plum thicket along the creek 2 autumns ago and had been going back every year since. "You're more domestic than people know," she said. "I've been living alone for a long time," he said. "You either learn to do things for yourself or you go without." "I'd rather do them." "How long?" she asked. "Since I was 22, he said. "More or less." I had a brief. He paused, looking out over the valley. "I was engaged once in Texas. It didn't come to anything. She was a good woman, but we wanted different things in the end, and it was better to know before than after." "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "It was the right outcome for both of us. She married a man in Austin and has 3 children, and by all accounts she's content." He looked at her. "I don't carry it as a wound, I carry it as information." She turned this over. "What kind of information?" "That being alone wasn't the worst thing," he said. "That I could manage it. That I was waiting, without knowing precisely what I was waiting for." The wind moved through the grass around them, and the paintbrush bent and straightened, patient and rhythmic. "And do you know now?" she asked. She kept her eyes on the valley, a silence, not uncomfortable. "I think I might," he said. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the grassland and the blue sky and the wildflowers were all around them, and the world was quiet enough that she could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of the grass. And she thought that she had spent the last 3 weeks telling herself she was grateful, only grateful, and that gratitude and love were different things, and she ought not confuse them. And she looked at Homer Sutton sitting on a blanket in the Kansas grassland with wild plum preserves on his thumb, and she understood that whatever this was, it had moved well beyond gratitude. "Homer," she said, using his name for the first time, and watched him absorb it. "I want to say something carefully, and I want you to hear it carefully." "I'm listening," he said. "I'm a widow of not quite 2 months," she said. "I have 2 children and a debt to you and a farm that is barely solvent and a reputation in this town that is cautious, let us say. I am not in a position to be careless about anything, including my own feelings." "I understand that," he said, and he did. She could see he did. "And at the same time," she said, "I would be dishonest if I pretended that spending these past weeks with you has not changed something in me, and I think you know that." "I know that," he said quietly. "I'm not ready to. I don't know what I'm ready for," she said honestly. "But I didn't want to not say it. I wanted it to be named." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Then let it be named, and let it move at whatever pace is right. There's no hurry, Minnie. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of that last sentence, the absolute, unhurried certainty of it, landed somewhere deep in her and stayed there, warm and permanent. She nodded, and he nodded, and they sat in the grass for another hour without anything being forced, watching the hawks circle in the thermals above the valley floor, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be actually known by someone, and she had not known, until now, exactly how much she had wanted it. She paid the first installment on the loan in July, when the milk income was good, and she sold 2 dozen jars of pickled vegetables at the market that ran on Fridays beside the feed store. She brought the money to his door in an envelope with the amount noted in her careful schoolteacher's script, and he received it without ceremony and entered it in the small ledger he had begun keeping for the purpose, and then he looked up and said, "Have you eaten?" "Not yet," she admitted, because it was nearly noon and she had been going since before sunrise. "I have a pot of beans on," he said. "Come in." She had been in his house a handful of times since that first morning, but always briefly, always with purpose. She stayed for lunch and then, because the afternoon was easy and the children were with Mrs. Henley until supper, and the conversation had moved from the loan to the philosophy book he was currently reading, a volume of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, which he handled the way she imagined a man handled something valuable. She stayed for 2 hours, and the afternoon light moved across the table and through the window, and she forgot to be strategic about any of it. She simply sat in a kitchen that smelled like beans and coffee and wood smoke and talked with a man she was in love with. Because that was the truth of it, and she was done being careful about naming things. He read her a passage from the Emerson. Something about self-reliance, about the necessity of trusting one's own instincts over the opinion of the crowd. She listened, and then she said, "I wonder if Emerson ever actually had to knock on every door in a town and be turned away." Homer looked at her with that quiet smile. "Probably not." "There is a difference," she said, "between choosing solitude and having it chosen for you." "Yes," he said, "though sometimes what's chosen for you points to what you needed anyway." She thought about that. She thought about the 30-day notice and the 4 days of closed doors, and the morning she had walked to the end of the road and knocked on the one door that had opened. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "That things point toward what you need." He turned the book over in his hands. "I believe that people can choose to read it that way," he said. "Whether the universe arranges it deliberately, I don't know, but I think the morning you knocked on my door was the best morning I'd had in a long time, so I am personally inclined to think something was pointing in the right direction." She looked at him across the table in the afternoon light. "Homer," she said. "Minnie," he said. "I think you should kiss me," she said, because she had her father's directness after all, and because the afternoon was golden and finite, and she was 30 years old and had decided, somewhere in the prairie grass with the paintbrush flowers bending in the wind, that she was done being cautious about her own life. He was very still for a moment, and then he stood from his chair and came around the table, and she stood too, and he took her face in both his hands, those careful, precise hands, and kissed her with a gentleness and a depth that made her feel, all at once, both wholly herself and completely undone. When they separated, she was breathing differently, and the light in the room seemed altered, and he kept his hands framing her face and looked at her with those gray eyes that were warmer than she had ever seen them, and she thought she had perhaps never been looked at quite this way before in her life. Not as a capable woman, not as a widow, not as a problem to be managed or a resource to be utilized, but simply as herself, all of herself, seen and wanted and valued. "I have been wanting to do that for about 5 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "Do you now?" he said, amused. "You are a quiet man," she said, "but you are not as unreadable as you think you are." He laughed genuinely, which she had not yet heard from him, a real laugh, surprised out of him, warm and unguarded, and it was the best sound she had heard in months. Summer moved through Caldwell the way Kansas summers do, relentlessly and beautifully, with heat that turned the prairie gold by August and thunderstorms that rolled in from the west with a drama that never ceased to impress her, lightning scripting across the sky and the thunder following in great rolling waves that Thomas loved with a passionate intensity and Clara endured with dignified calm. The corn came in better than the previous year. The cow continued to produce. Minnie took on 3 days a week helping at the schoolhouse. The teacher, Miss Aldridge, had a gift for arithmetic and a difficulty with the younger children's reading instruction, and Minnie had the reverse capability, and the arrangement suited them both and added a steady small income. Homer was a regular presence in her life now, acknowledged openly and without apology. He came for supper on Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons, and the town talked about it in the way towns talk, with a mixture of speculation and opinion, some of it warm and some of it the particular brand of critical that forms around a widow perceived to have moved too quickly. Mrs. Francis Dull, who had not been able to help Minnie in her crisis, took a position on the matter that was expressed through pointed silences at the general store. Robert Harrington told Pete Stave that it seemed indecent, which Pete Stave relayed without editorial to Homer, who received the information without visible reaction and simply continued appearing at Minnie's gate on Wednesday evenings with whatever seasonal thing he'd brought from his garden: tomatoes in July, pole beans in August, the first winter squash in September. Minnie was aware of the talk and chose to be unapologetic about it. She had learned something in the spring about what the opinion of Caldwell was worth in a practical crisis, and while she bore no malice toward her neighbors and understood that most of them were limited by the same human frailty that limited everyone, she had reorganized her relationship to their approval. It mattered less than it had. Homer mattered more. Thomas had recovered fully from his broken arm, the cast removed in late July to the boy's enormous relief, and he had spent exactly 1 week practicing restraint before returning to the apple tree at a lower height, with a caution that passed for wisdom. He had also, in the interim, attached himself to Homer with the permanence of morning dew on grass. It simply appeared every day, natural and expected. Homer had begun teaching him, very simply, how to identify animal tracks and read the wind direction, and understand the basic principles of where water ran in relation to topography, the kind of knowledge that was genuinely useful in this land, and Thomas absorbed it with the solemn dedication he brought to everything. Clara's relationship with Homer was different, more mutual, more conversational. She had read all the books in their house twice, and Homer had, quietly and without announcement, begun lending her books from his shelf, one at a time, which she returned with opinions that were precise and occasionally startling. He had found a copy of a natural history book in a shop in Wichita when he rode up there in August on horse-breaking work, and he had brought it back for her, and Clara had held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment with an expression of pure, unguarded joy before composing herself and saying thank you in her serious way. And Homer had said she was very welcome in his equally serious way. And Minnie had watched this exchange from the doorway, and felt something in her chest so large and warm that it had nowhere to go except out through her eyes, quietly. He asked her to marry him on a September evening when the first cool was coming into the air, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were beginning to turn, and the light had that particular quality of late autumn on the plains, low and amber and elegiac. They had been walking the perimeter of the farm. He did this with her sometimes, the practical survey of what needed doing before winter, and they had stopped at the cottonwood tree by Edmund's grave, because she stopped there every evening, and he had stood beside her while she was quiet, and then he had said her name. She had turned, and he was facing her with the steady directness that was the foundation of everything she knew about him, and he had said, "Minnie, I know the pace of what's happened between us, and I know what people say, and I know it's been less than 6 months since Edmund passed. I am not asking because I am impatient or because I don't respect what you carry about him. I'm asking because I have never in my life been more certain of anything, and because I think you know that, and because I would rather ask too soon and be told to wait than lose a single day of being plain about what I want." She looked at the grave for a moment, and then at him. The amber light was on his face, and his gray eyes were clear and certain, and she thought about Edmund, who had been a good man, and who she had loved in the way of a young woman who chooses carefully and builds steadily, and she thought that Edmund would have known Homer Sutton's quality within the first 5 minutes of meeting him and would have approved, because Edmund had been good enough to recognize goodness in others. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me, Minnie Morgan?" he said. "Will you let me be a husband to you and whatever the children want me to be to them, whatever they're comfortable with? And will you let me build something with you here on this land that lasts?" "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "Yes, Homer, I will." He kissed her by the cottonwood tree in the amber September light, and it was nothing like the first kiss that had been a discovery, the sudden revelation of something unknown. This was something else. This was a promise made by two people who had looked at each other honestly and chosen deliberately, and it had the quality of something that had already become true before it was spoken aloud. They were married in November, just as the first hard frost came to the prairie, and the sky turned the deep gray blue of winter coming in. Reverend Dalt performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. He had, it emerged, thought well of Homer Sutton for some time, and had been cautiously pleased to see the way things were developing. Mrs. Henley cried happily throughout the ceremony and pressed Minnie's hands afterward with both of hers. Miss Aldridge brought a cake that was lopsided and delicious. Even Pete Stave at the livery, who was not given to sentiment, shook Homer's hand twice. The opposition was present but quieter than expected. Gerald Fitch attended because he attended all civic events and maintained a determinedly neutral expression throughout. Robert Harrington did not attend, which Minnie noted without surprise and without injury. Francis Dull sent a gift, a very practical quilt in blue and cream, which Minnie took as the olive branch it was probably meant to be and wrote a genuine thank-you note. Clara wore her best dress and held Thomas's hand, and watched the ceremony with the expression of a child who has been managing anxiously toward an outcome and is now witnessing it arrive. When the ceremony was complete and Homer kissed Minnie briefly and warmly in front of the assembled company, Clara looked up at Homer with those grave eyes and said, "We are glad you are here," with the full weight of official statement. Homer crouched down to be at her level and said, "I am very glad to be here, Clara." He looked at Thomas, who was vibrating with suppressed excitement beside his sister. "Both of you, I want you to know that I am not trying to replace anyone. I am just here for all of it." Thomas launched himself at Homer with the full physical enthusiasm of 5-year-old approval, and Homer caught him and stood up with the boy on his arm, laughing, and Minnie watched her new husband holding her son in the narrow wooden church in Caldwell, Kansas, with November light in the windows and the smell of pine and candle wax in the air. And she thought that she had knocked on every door in this town and been turned away, and that the door that had opened at the end of the road had turned out to be the one that led here, to this moment, to this man, and that the universe might or might not arrange these things deliberately, but that she was going to spend the rest of her life being grateful for the arrangement regardless. He moved into the farmhouse, which required some reorganization and some repair. Homer had strong opinions about structural soundness and spent his first weekend as a married man replacing 2 boards on the back porch and releveling the kitchen door, which had been dragging on its frame since October. His books arrived in 2 crates, which filled out the previously sparse shelf space and added several additions that Clara examined with focused intensity and began requesting to borrow within the first week. They settled into each other with a naturalness that surprised Minnie, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They had been operating in close domestic proximity for months, and the comfort they had built was simply relocated and formalized. He was the same Homer she had been coming to know, steady, precise, attentive, unexpectedly tender when tenderness was called for, direct and honest even when directness was inconvenient. He did not fill the house with noise. He filled it with a quality of presence that was warm and grounding, the way a well-built stove fills a room, not loud, but the thing you orient yourself toward when the cold comes in. He was also, she discovered, a better cook than she had realized, which he revealed gradually over the first weeks of winter, beginning with the information that he had a technique for venison stew that was notably superior to hers and culminating in Christmas, when he produced a honey cake from a recipe he had learned from an old woman in Texas who had kept bees and had taught him, 17 years ago, the correct management of heat and proportion that made it extraordinary. The children received this cake with the reverence it deserved, and Homer received from Thomas a lumpy clay figure of a horse that Thomas had made at school and presented with the complete seriousness of a person offering something of significant value, which it was. Winter on the Kansas prairie was a thing to be managed carefully. The cold came with conviction, and the wind did not negotiate. They were prepared. Wood stacked deep against the house, stores laid in, the cow in the barn with extra hay. Homer had added significant practical insulation to the north wall of the farmhouse in the weeks before the freeze came, working with the methodical foresight that was characteristic of him. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed across the flat land and rattled the windows, they sat by the stove, the four of them, and Homer read aloud from history, from natural history, from one wonderful long novel that he had in his crate, and that took all of January to get through, reading after supper with both children pressed against his sides and Minnie across from him with her sewing, listening. These evenings were the quietest and most complete joy Minnie had experienced since she could remember. The lamplight, the reading voice, the warm proximity of people she loved, the wind howling outside with no ability to reach them. It was the thing she had been building toward without knowing it, the life she had been unable to articulate but had always understood as possibility. She paid the final installment on the loan in February, clearing the debt entirely. She brought the full accounting to Homer across the supper table, and he looked at the numbers and nodded and said she should tear up the note, and she said she was going to keep it actually, and he looked at her with a question. "To remember," she said, "that I paid it, that I did it properly." He understood this completely and nodded again and said of course, and they said no more about it, and she put the note in the tin beneath the floorboard where she had kept her $40, which now held considerably more, which was its own quiet satisfaction. Spring came back to the prairie in the second year, the way spring always comes to that land reluctantly, and then all at once, the grass going from brown to a startling green in what felt like a single morning, the wildflowers appearing as if they had been waiting with great patience just beneath the surface. The cottonwood trees leafed out in their pale green, and the birds returned, and the air smelled of turned earth and new growth. And Minnie stood in her garden on a morning in April with her hands dirty, and the sun warm on her back, and thought that she was happy, which was different from being relieved, and different from being grateful, and different from being determined, all of which she had also been, and which had their own value. But happy was its own category, and it was real, and it was here. She was also, as of that April morning, about 8 weeks pregnant, which she had confirmed to herself in the private way of women who have been through pregnancy before, and which she had not yet told Homer, because she had been sitting with the knowledge for 2 weeks, enjoying the private certainty of it before she was ready to release it into the shared air of their life together. She told him that evening, after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the spring night outside the windows. She simply said, "I believe we are going to have a baby in November." He was very still for a moment, in the way he was still when something moved him deeply. His hands were flat on the table, and he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, something that started as disbelief and opened into something vast and unguarded and overwhelming in the best way. The way a man looks when the thing he has wanted but not dared to want fully reveals itself as real. "Minnie," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "November," she said again quietly, "so we have time." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she felt the strength and warmth and steadiness of them, the same hands that had set her son's broken arm and fixed her fence and held books in the lamplight, and she turned her hands over and held his back. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood and came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, and the spring night outside, and the sleeping children behind their door, and the new life that was beginning its quiet work. And she thought that this was the full accounting, the whole sum of what she had been owed by life, and had been afraid she would never collect. Clara and Thomas, received the information about the expected baby, with different but equally characteristic responses. Thomas immediately wanted to know if it would be a boy or a girl, decided he wanted a brother, and then amended this to say either would be acceptable, but a brother would be more useful. Clara considered the matter seriously and said that it was good news and that she would help with the baby, which she intended to be understood as a commitment rather than a generosity, which it was. Homer built a cradle through the summer, working in the evenings with wood he had selected carefully from a maple he had taken from the creek bottom during winter cutting. And the cradle was beautiful, not ornate, but shaped with the same precision and care that he brought to everything, smoothed until the wood was warm to the touch. The joints fitted perfectly. He made it when he thought Minnie wasn't watching, and she watched him make nearly all of it from the window above the kitchen table, and she cherished every evening of watching. He was going to be an extraordinary father. She knew this the way she knew other foundational things, the way she knew the farm would be solvent by year's end, the way she knew Clara would be formidable and Thomas would be steady and strong, the way she knew the wildflowers would come back every spring to the low rise east of town where they had eaten plum preserves and looked out over the valley and named the thing between them for the first time. Some things you simply know. The summer was a good one. The crop yield was the best since they had worked the land, partially due to Homer's study of the soil and his adjustments to the planting rotation, which he had read about, and then applied with characteristic methodical patience. He had also negotiated a horse-breaking contract with a large ranch 20 miles east, which brought in a significant payment in July that changed the financial landscape of the farm from manageable to genuinely comfortable. A difference that Minnie felt in the particular ease of buying Thomas new boots for fall without doing arithmetic in her head first. The town had largely settled into accepting the Suttons as a fixture. The early disapproval had faded, as it tends to fade when its subjects simply continue their life without seeking permission, and Homer's quiet competence and general reliability had done their slow work on the town's estimation of him. He helped pull a wagon out of a ditch for the Coopers in August without being asked. He assisted Doc Perkins with a situation that required a steady hand and no particular squeamishness. When a fire started in the storage room behind Henderson's General Store on a September afternoon, Homer was the second person on the scene and the most effective, and afterward Henderson had shaken his hand and said thank you with enough genuine feeling to cover a considerable portion of prior distance. Even Robert Harrington eventually came around, in the autumn way of stubborn men who find their obstinacy gradually worn down by evidence. He met Homer at the feed store in October and said, stiffly but sincerely, that he'd heard good things about the Sutton farm's yield and asked about the planting method. And Homer answered without any reference to prior awkwardness, and the conversation lasted 20 minutes and ended in a handshake. Minnie heard about it from Pete Stave, who heard everything, and she told Homer at supper, and he shrugged in his unconcerned way and said he had no quarrel with Harrington and never had, and she smiled and put more biscuits on his plate. The baby came on a November morning, 11 days before the date Minnie had estimated, arriving with the efficiency of a child who had been ready and had decided not to wait. It was a boy, born at dawn with Doc Perkins in attendance and Homer in the next room with the children, Thomas pressing his ear against the wall with complete attention, and Clara sitting with her hands folded in her lap, formally composed and visibly tense, and the baby announced his arrival with a cry that was strong and unambiguous, and immediately filled the house with something new. Homer came into the bedroom with permission, after Doc Perkins had done everything necessary and declared mother and child both healthy, and he came to the bed and looked at his son, red-faced and furious and absolutely whole, and Minnie watched his face go through the same unguarded transformation she had seen at the kitchen table in April, only deeper and more complete, the expression of a man who is looking at the full realization of something he had not known, until recently. that he was allowed to want. "He's angry," Homer said softly. "He is," she agreed. "He'll calm down." "What do you want to call him?" he asked, not looking away from the baby. She had thought about this for months. "James," she said. "James Homer Sutton." He looked at her then, and she saw everything that moved through him in that second: gratitude and love and something too large to have a single name. And he took her free hand very gently and held it, and he said, "James Homer Sutton," trying it, and she heard in the way he said it that the name was already real, already belonging to the small, red-faced person between them, already woven into the fabric of everything. Clara and Thomas were brought in to meet their brother with the ceremony appropriate to significant occasions. Thomas examined James with scientific interest and declared that he was smaller than expected, but that this would change. Clara held him very briefly, very carefully, and looked down at his face with an expression of surprised tenderness that broke briefly through the composure she maintained as a matter of policy. And then she looked at Minnie and said, "He is a good baby, Mama," with such earnest conviction that Minnie nearly laughed and nearly cried simultaneously, which was becoming her characteristic response to the large feelings of this life she was living. James grew. November became December, and the first snow came to the prairie, and the world outside went white and still. And inside the farmhouse, there was the sound of a baby's breathing, and the smell of cedar and wood smoke, and the warmth of people together in the cold. Homer took to the sleepless architecture of having a new infant with the same steady pragmatism he brought to everything difficult. He rose for the night feedings without complaint and walked James through the kitchen in the deep hours, his voice low and continuous, talking to the baby the way he talked to frightened horses, unhurried and calm, until James subsided. Minnie would lie in the dark and listen to her husband's voice through the wall and the sound of her son settling, and she would think about the full distance from the day she had buried Edmund in the dry October ground with 30 days and $40 and 2 children to feed, to this night in this warm house with this man and these children and this new life. And she would understand again, always again, what it meant to come through the worst thing to the best thing. What it meant to have gone to the end of the road and knocked on the last door and had it open. Spring came again to Caldwell, Kansas, the third spring since Minnie Morgan had become a widow on a dry October night, the second spring since she had become Minnie Sutton on a cold November morning in Reverend Dalt's narrow church. James was 4 months old and had stopped being angry about his existence, having apparently concluded that the world, on balance, had its merits, particularly the people in it, who responded to his expressions with a gratifying consistency. He had Homer's gray eyes and her dark hair and Thomas's gift for complete presence in whatever he was engaged in, and he was loved with the full and undivided attention of every person in the house, including Clara, who had quietly abandoned her professional reserve on the subject, and could be regularly found lying on the floor beside his blanket, reading to him from the natural history book, her voice quiet and serious and entirely devoted. On a Sunday in April, the family rode out together on the low rise east of town. All 4 of them, 5 of them now, Homer with James in a carrier he had constructed from suggestions in a book about Plains native practices, a clever arrangement of cloth and soft leather that held the baby secure against his chest. And they ate bread and cheese and wild plum preserves from a new jar that Homer had put up the previous autumn, and the Indian paintbrush was blooming, brilliant and red-orange in the new green grass, and the sky was immense and blue, and the hawk was circling in the thermals as it always seemed to be over this particular valley. Thomas was running through the grass with his arms spread, being either an eagle or a locomotive. It was difficult to determine which. Clara was on her stomach in the grass examining something very small and important. Homer was sitting beside Minnie with James sleeping against his chest, one large hand curved protectively over the baby's back, and the afternoon light was doing what it always did out here, turning everything gold and significant. "Do you remember," Minnie said, "the first time we came here?" "Every detail," he said. "You had plum preserves on your thumb," she said. He looked at his thumb, faintly amused. "And you told me you'd been waiting without knowing what for," she said. "I remember." She leaned against his shoulder carefully so as not to disturb the sleeping baby, and he put his arm around her, and she felt the solidity of him, the complete reliability of him, the fact of him, and she thought about the doors. She thought about every door that had stayed closed against her. She thought about what it had felt like to walk to the end of the road that last time with nothing left to lose, the weight of failure behind her and the weight of necessity ahead, and to knock on a plain red door and have it open. She thought that the doors that stayed closed had been necessary too, that she had needed every single one of them to stay shut so that she would arrive at the end, at the one that opened. That the geography of her situation had led her here with the precision of water finding its level, and that she would not undo any part of it, not the grief or the fear or the closed doors or the 4 days of neighbors' apologetic faces, because all of it together had been the road that brought her to this rise in the Kansas prairie with a man's arm around her and her children in the spring grass and a sleeping baby between them. "Homer," she said. "Minnie," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt the steadiness of his breathing. "You knocked," he said. "That was the brave part. That was all you." Thomas came running back from wherever he had been running, flushed and breathless, declaring he had found a meadowlark nest and that everyone must come immediately. James stirred against Homer's chest and made a small, indignant sound at being disturbed. Clara rose from her examination of the small, important thing in the grass, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone accustomed to being interrupted at significant moments, and came to look at the baby with the evaluating tenderness she always brought to this task. Homer stood carefully, the baby held secure, and took Minnie's hand and helped her up, and they went to look at Thomas's meadowlark nest, 4 small eggs in a cup of woven grass, perfect and complete, sitting there in the middle of the prairie as if the world were nothing but abundance and continuation, as if this were simply the way of things. New life arriving in the most ordinary and extraordinary way, tended by a presence that did not leave. And standing there in the spring grass of the Kansas prairie in the year 1880, with the meadowlark's nest at their feet and the paintbrush flowers around them and the immense sky overhead, Minnie Sutton, who had been Minnie Morgan, who had been a widow with a notice and $40 and 2 children, and a failing farm and the closed doors of an entire town behind her, held her husband's hand and looked at her 4 children and felt the full, unreserved, completely realized happiness of a person who has been brought by difficult roads to exactly the right place. There were more years ahead of them. More seasons and more work and more snow on the prairie and more spring wildflowers on the rise east of town. There would be a second child they had together, a girl, born 2 years later, whom they named Alina after Homer's mother, and who arrived with the same gray eyes as James and her own fierce and individual spirit that was entirely her own invention. There would be good harvests and one hard year when the drought came and tested everything, and they would face it the way they faced everything together, directly, without pretense. Thomas would grow into a man of considerable steadiness, who would take over half the farm and eventually marry a woman from the next county who matched him completely. Clara would leave for the normal school in Emporia at 17 and become, as predicted, formidable. A teacher first and then a school administrator of noted distinction, who returned home every Christmas and sat at the table and talked with her stepfather about books with the intensity of a debate that had been ongoing for 10 years and showed no signs of resolution. James would grow up to be a veterinarian, trained in Kansas City, who came home to the prairie because he had his father's understanding that a piece of land and the people on it were worth more than most things. All of that was ahead of them, in the years to come, in the full and continuing life of the Sutton family on the farm at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas. But on this April afternoon, in the meadowlark's presence and the paintbrush light and the spring wind, It was enough, more than enough. It was everything to simply be here, having arrived. Minnie squeezed her husband's hand, and he squeezed back, and the children were all around them, and the prairie was enormous and alive, and the hawk was still circling in the blue above the valley, patient and free, riding the warm air with the complete confidence of something that knows exactly where it belongs. As did she.